Imagine this. In the heart of Europe, there stands a castle. Once the gates are shut, the screams inside are silenced. And at night, blood is spilled silently. She was a noblewoman. She was beautiful, intelligent, and powerful. But history remembers her by a darker name, the Blood Countess. Elizabeth Báthory. Her story is dark and mysterious. In this video, we'll show you the 10 most shocking facts about her life. But don't miss fact number 3. You won't believe what you hear. If you're ready, the doors are closing. The darkness begins. Fact 1. She was beautiful, but a storm raged inside. Elizabeth Báthory was known for her legendary beauty. She was born into one of the richest and most influential families in Hungary. Even as a teenager, people would say, "She's a stunning and intelligent young woman." But behind that beauty hid a very dark soul. She appeared to be graceful and refined, the perfect noble lady. But it was only a mask, because inside her something much darker was growing. She wasn't just a beautiful aristocrat. She was a storm born of power and cruelty. Fact 2. As a child, she watched executions and enjoyed them. Elizabeth's childhood was spent in fairy tale-like castles. But this fairy tale was steeped in darkness. In noble families of the time, it was normal for children to witness executions. They were meant to teach justice in the true face of power. But Elizabeth didn't flinch. In fact, her eyes would gleam with a strange light. One day, a servant accused of theft was publicly executed in the family courtyard, torn apart alive. Elizabeth watched, not in fear, but with fascination. Some even say she smiled during the execution. She wasn't horrified. She was learning. Those violent scenes etched themselves into her mind and would later inspire the brutal tortures she became infamous for. She was just a child, but she had already tasted darkness. Fact 3. Bathing in blood keeps you young. Myth or belief? There's a legend that shook all of Europe. Elizabeth Báthory bathed in the blood of young girls to stay young forever. It all started with a moment. One day, a maid pulled Elizabeth's hair while brushing it. Enraged, Elizabeth slapped her. The girl bled, and a drop of blood landed on Elizabeth's hand. That patch of skin looked smoother, younger. In that moment, a twisted idea was born in her mind. Could blood be the secret to eternal youth? After that, the tortures began. Girls were kidnapped, locked in dungeons. Their blood was spilled. Some say she filled entire bathtubs with it and bathed inside, believing it would preserve her beauty. Was it a myth? Or did she truly believe it? The terrifying part is, she believed it herself. She valued beauty so deeply, she was willing to sacrifice innocent lives for it. Fact 4. Taught the art of torture by her husband. At just 15, Elizabeth was married. Her husband, Ferenc Nadasdy, was a famous warrior. They called him the Black Knight. Known for his cruelty and battlefield torture techniques, he was the first to feed the darkness inside Elizabeth. He gave her unusual gifts, like torture devices designed to crush and mutilate human bodies. Some sources claim he taught her how to torture, and worse, he allowed her to practice on living victims. In that era, it was rare for women to commit such acts of brutality, but Elizabeth embraced the role with passion. It's said that Ferenc brought some of his war torture methods back home, and that changed Elizabeth forever. She was no longer just a noblewoman. She had become an artist of pain, a woman who saw beauty in suffering and power in fear. Fact 5. She worked with witches and sorcerers. Elizabeth Báthory wasn't just a killer. To build her empire of cruelty, she relied not only on daggers and dungeons, but also on dark magic. Unusual for her time, Elizabeth surrounded herself with mystics, people labeled as witches. These individuals guided her through magical rituals, gave her protective spells, and even described her torture ceremonies as spiritual sacrifices. The most terrifying part? According to some sources, Elizabeth offered human victims in rituals meant to communicate with demons. Seeking immortality, she would drink blood, burn body parts, and perform occult ceremonies at midnight. These weren't rare events. They became part of her daily routine. Elizabeth didn't just master physical torment, she became a high priestess of spiritual agony. Fact 6. She had her own torture chamber. Inside Elizabeth Báthory's castle, there was a room unlike any other. A cold, windowless dungeon with stone walls and chains rusted from suffering. Sunlight never touched this place, but it was never silent. Screams echoed through the darkness. Torture here was more than physical. It was mental and spiritual. Victims were sometimes hung motionless for hours, or submerged in freezing water until their minds shattered. Elizabeth would stab needles into their skin, burn them with wax, break them piece by piece. According to surviving servants, the cries of the dying were never heard outside, because this dungeon wasn't a prison. It was Elizabeth's private theater of horror, and those who entered never came out again. Fact 7. Murderer or researcher? She took notes on her victims. After her capture, officials discovered Elizabeth's notebooks, and what they found was chilling. She hadn't just killed, she had documented her victims. Every wound, every reaction, every detail, recorded with a disturbing precision. This wasn't the madness of a lunatic. It was the obsession of someone who treated pain like science. Elizabeth was building her own twisted field of beauty research using real human beings. And this level of cold, methodical cruelty left people asking, was she a monster or something far more terrifying? Fact 8. One woman, one castle. Against an army. After her husband's death, Elizabeth ruled her land alone. And during a time of chaos, the Ottomans attacked. But Elizabeth didn't run. She organized her own private army, fortified her castle, and declared herself commander. She was ruthless, strategic, and fearless. Not just a noble woman, but a military leader. Her enemies called her a witch. Her allies called her the Iron Lady. She sat at war councils with men, matched generals in strategy, and led a fortress through blood and fire. She wasn't just a killer, she was a queen of war and death. Fact 9. Justice, or just a political game. When Elizabeth Báthory was finally arrested, she was held responsible for the deaths of hundreds of young girls. But was this truly justice, or just a political setup? First, it's important to know, Elizabeth wasn't just any noblewoman. She was the heiress of one of the most powerful and wealthy families in Hungary. Her lands, her castles, her influence, they had become a threat to the Hungarian crown. And that threat had to be eliminated. In 1609, she was officially accused. But strangely, Elizabeth herself was never put on trial. Only her servants faced court, and most of them gave confessions under brutal torture. Some witnesses even claimed they saw no evidence against her, but those voices were quickly silenced. After her arrest, all her properties were seized by the crown, which raises the question, was this all part of a plan to silence her? Yes, her cruelty might have been real, but why then? And why in such a specific, orchestrated way? Some historians argue that her real crime wasn't the murders. It was being a powerful, independent woman. She commanded her own estates, maintained a private army, and dared to interfere in political affairs, in a world ruled by men. So yes, and maybe she was a monster, but maybe, just maybe, she was a political sacrifice. Fact 10. Swallowed by the walls. A living sentence. When judgment was passed on Elizabeth Báthory, she wasn't executed. She was simply too rich, too noble. Even the royal family feared the consequences of her death. So, they found a more terrifying punishment. A small room was built inside her own castle. The walls were thick. There were no windows, only a tiny opening, just big enough to pass her food. In this room, no sunlight ever entered. No voices echoed. Time itself seemed to stop. She was alone. But worse than loneliness was something deeper, oblivion. The woman who changed the fate of thousands of girls had fallen into a trap of her own fate. They say in her final days, she talked to the walls, heard echoes of her past, saw bloodstains, and whispered names into the darkness. Reality, memory, madness, all blurred together. To her, the world became nothing more than a dark box, just a few steps wide. It was a death that didn't come swiftly, but slowly took her, piece by piece, And finally, after 4 years, that living tomb devoured her completely. Elizabeth Báthory, a woman sentenced while still alive, and in silence, she disappeared. Elizabeth Báthory. Beauty, terror, power, and psychological darkness all wrapped in one. Her story is not just a frightening tale from the past. It's a riddle still full of unanswered questions. So now we ask you, was she truly a sadistic killer? Or was she one of the most powerful women of her time, silenced by fear? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll be the first to hear our next mysterious tale.